What's up, you guys? Welcome to today's video. As you can tell by the title, we're going to be talking about schizophrenia. I'm also going to show you guys hallucinations caught on camera, and this conversation is so important. I don't think that we talk about schizophrenia enough. I'm also going to be doing this episode with Cody Green, who is a diagnosed schizophrenic and my close personal friend. If you guys are new here, hi, my name is Jess. I'm a person in long-term recovery who has served time in prison, and my entire crazy life story is in the description box down below. If you want to follow me on any other social media platform, TikTok, Instagram, Patreon, that's $2. It's only ever going to be $2. All of that is linked down below, as well as my podcast, which you are seeing today. If you want to listen to that on Spotify, that's in the description box. Also, my vlog channel is in the description box. Please go subscribe to that. It really freaking helps. All right, let's kick this thing off. Just kidding. Before we start this episode, I would like to show you guys some of Cody's TikToks. We're gonna get into it later in the episode, but he uses his phone as a tool to help differentiate between real and a hallucination. But he has also been recording himself inside of his house so that he can catch these symptoms on camera so that other people can know what it looks like, and just to educate people on TikTok, which I think is so important. So I'm going to show you guys a couple of his TikToks, and then we're gonna get into the episode.
Stop.
I haven't been hallucinating as much recently, but my security camera caught this last week.
Quiet down. Because Allison has to work in the morning too, and she's trying to sleep. None of that is true. Stop.
Starts biting my nails. I wanted to see if he was really there, so I used my phone to see if I could see him. Then double-checked my security camera phone app.
Stop. Not there. I know you're not. No.
What's up, you guys? Welcome to the very first episode that we're putting on YouTube. I have a very special guest here. This is Schizophrenic Hippie, aka Cody Green, and we're going to be talking about schizophrenia and whatever else I decide to ask him. I am obsessed with mental health, and I'm so grateful that he's here with us because we get to learn today from somebody that is not only diagnosed schizophrenic, but has a mom that is diagnosed schizophrenic. You're a mental health advocate, you're a motivational speaker, and you do so much for the community. So I'm so happy that you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I'm also going to move this microphone 80,000 times during this episode.
All right. Do I need to move mine that many times?
Maybe. Okay. The first episode that we're doing video is always like crazy. I wasn't even set up and ready for him. I guess the first question that I have for you, for those that maybe don't know, what is undifferentiated schizophrenia, which is what you were diagnosed with?
So undifferentiated schizophrenia is one of the types. There used to be several different types of schizophrenia. So it was undifferentiated, paranoid schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia, and disorganized schizophrenia. Undifferentiated is the type that kind of encapsulates all the different types. So I was showing symptoms of every single type of schizophrenia. Now schizophrenia is actually diagnosed as a spectrum. So I believe that if I was re-diagnosed, it would just be schizophrenia instead of the undifferentiated.
That makes a lot of sense. Essentially, that just means that you showed signs for everything.
Yeah, so there was times where paranoia was the biggest factor in my schizophrenia. There were times where, when it came to my symptoms, I was more catatonic and not able to function properly. So I ended up falling into that category where I was showing signs from all the different types.
And at what age were you when you realized something's wrong, something is going on, and I need to get some professional help?
I mean, I was 19 when I started having symptoms. I don't think I came to terms with it until I went to jail. So it was like closer to me being like 21 where I started realizing myself that, you know, my wife and mom had been telling me for a while that I was struggling. I refused to believe it. And so there was a couple years there where I went undiagnosed, I went untreated, and that's when my addiction happened, and that's when my incarceration happened. So it wasn't until after all of that I was finally like, yeah, I might have some issues.
There's something going on here.
Yeah, there might be something wrong with my brain.
How did that affect Allison before you were diagnosed, and after your diagnosis, how did that change in her life?
I think the toughest thing for her was that she could tell something was going on and I refused to believe it. When you're delusional and paranoid, you kind of get into a thought process of everyone is against me, everyone is trying to trick me, everyone has some sort of vendetta out against me. There was actually a point where I was so delusional that I thought Allison was trying to poison my food. And so I think it was really difficult for her, primarily because even though we knew that my mom had those symptoms, until I was properly diagnosed, it was a big question mark. For her, I couldn't imagine like trying to understand what was going wrong with me or like what was different about me, because I went through this shift. And so after I got diagnosed, it was nice because we could put a name to it, we could get treatment, and she was there through the whole treatment process too. So not only did she stick it out through the worst part, which was the undiagnosed, the addiction, but she also had to go with me through the recovery process and the treatment process as well.
I think when we're talking about mental health and how it affects us personally, I think there is a whole dialogue missing from how that affects our family and our loved ones. You know, as hard as that was for you, I know that was really hard for Allison as well. And she's a literal saint. She would not poison your food.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I got lucky with Allison for sure. And there was also the aspect too of like my mom. So with my mom, I couldn't imagine how difficult it was getting through your own diagnosis and treatment and then having to watch your child go through that as well. So that was really difficult, I think, when I realized what she also had to go through watching me deal with all this.
Man, I mean, schizophrenia, not to make this about me, but schizophrenia was the first thing that I learned about in mental health because my best friend growing up, her mom was schizophrenic and I didn't understand it. And I didn't know why. For her, her symptoms were that she was very cold and distant and didn't know how to manage emotions. And that really hurt my friend. And I knew there was something deeper that adults didn't want to share with me as a kid. And then I started to get older and realized her diagnosis. She very recently passed away, but she was kind of like the cornerstone for me in getting into psychology and understanding it. So what symptoms do you have? I know you've talked a lot on TikTok about auditory and visual hallucinations, but just for people that are listening to this specific episode, what does that look like for you pre-medicine? Because this is very interesting, and I don't think a lot of people understand this. What do your symptoms look like before you got your medicine, and what do they look like now?
Yeah, and that's a huge difference for me because before I was medicated, as I was just talking about, I was paranoid and delusional. I had delusions that were so severe that after a car accident I was in, I actually thought that I was in a coma from that car accident. Wow. And so I thought everything happening around me was just a dream I was having from a coma. And so I was delusional to the point where I thought the only way to get back to my real life was to end this life. And so there was delusions, there was paranoia. And now the things that I struggle with the most are just auditory and visual hallucinations. And I say just like that's not bad, but compared to, you know, the delusions I was dealing with and the constant paranoia, I get a lot of comments on my videos when people see me struggling with auditory and visual hallucinations. They're like, well, then why do you take meds if they don't work? And I'm like, first of all, they do work. You don't get to see how I was before medication, because people only get to see me now that I'm pretty functional. I would say high functioning. I don't like using that term, but it does describe me compared to how I was before medication.
Right. And as far as the hallucinations that you would have before medicine, what did they look like versus what they look like now?
I have talked about this a few times, specifically because everyone always wants to know what I'm seeing and hearing. Yeah. Before medication, my visual hallucinations were mostly faceless people. I would see a lot more frightening things as well. So I used to see things that I would refer to as demons. It's not like what you would see in a horror movie, but like, to me, they were demons. It's what they referred to themselves as. Wow. I used to see faceless people a lot. I used to see things that just didn't make a lot of sense either, because I was so delusional at the time that some of my visual hallucinations I look back at and I'm like, there's no possible way that was real. Like a faceless person walking like a jungle cat down the road, like things that just made no sense. Yeah. And it's because like when you're that delusional, there's no part of your brain that questions things like that.
Wow. I mean, it makes sense when you say it like that. Like I wasn't questioning myself because my brain was unable to do so.
Yeah. And that's like the whole reason I went undiagnosed for a while, is when you're having those symptoms, even if you have moments of clarity, what you want is to believe they're not true. But that's why I started using drugs, actually, was a way for me to cope, because one of the things I was running into was I was so afraid of what was happening. And I think in the back of my mind, I knew that I was developing schizophrenia, but I didn't want it to be that. So the process in my brain was, the thoughts that I went through were, well, if I'm using drugs, I can blame what I'm seeing and hearing on the drugs.
Wow.
So that's actually what got me like addicted to drugs, was just me trying to cope with what I was seeing and hearing, trying to make it not my brain. I wanted there to be another excuse for it.
Let you take a sip. It makes so much sense that you just did not want it to be schizophrenia. Anything but schizophrenia. Drug use, I'm crazy, not schizophrenia.
Well, and especially having a mother that was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, I did have to see not only how hard it was for her to get through that and for her to get treatment, but it was also like how people viewed my mom. So we had friends and family members. We had people that didn't know my mom who would tell me things like, oh, I just want to make sure you're okay. They're like, your mom is not in a good place. And she definitely wasn't the most stable person, but she was always there for us. She always made sure that we were doing all right. And I think that's what made her symptoms so bad, was she prioritized us over her, even when we were, super broke and we were living just the three of us in an efficiency apartment. And she always made sure that we were doing well despite her mental health.
The stigma that you just mentioned surrounding schizophrenia is so real. And I know you've seen it firsthand, both with your mom and now with you, especially having the platform size that you do. And we're going to get to that in a second. I just want to back up a little bit, because I don't think you mentioned what your visual hallucinations look like now with medicine.
So with medication now, my hallucinations are mostly just regular people. So I do still occasionally get some of those terrifying hallucinations that I used to. It's pretty rare for me, though. Most of the time, what I'm hallucinating is just random people that I don't recognize. And a lot of the times it's while I'm interacting with other people. So if there's 3 people in front of me and one of them are a hallucination, I can't tell the difference. And a lot of people that comes back to the people asking me, well, why wouldn't you recognize someone that or I guess that brings me to like one of the comments I always get is, why wouldn't you recognize if someone you didn't know was in your house? And that comes back to delusions playing a big role in hallucinations.
Your brain is working to create this illusion that there is somebody there. So your brain can't simultaneously differentiate between, I know this person is in my house. I mean, it sounds logical, but the brain is so complex. And the way that these hallucinations happen for you, it can't multitask. So you actually use your phone to differentiate between real and hallucinate. Why can't I say that word? between what is real and a
hallucination. You got it.
I can't say it. Hallucination. So can you tell everyone what you do and how you use your phone as a tool and why the brain just you talk. I can't talk today.
So the reason that I started using my phone was because I actually did it by accident the very first time. I was talking to someone and I pulled out my phone and it was during the time where I started TikTok and I was recording stuff all the time. So I pulled out my phone and my camera was already up. And I noticed that the person I was talking to was not in the camera. And I identified that that person wasn't really there. And so I realized that this could be a tool I use regularly. So if I'm talking to someone and I do have a moment of clarity where I'm like, I don't think this person is really there, then I'll actually pull out my phone and I'll check to see if I can see them through the camera on my phone. Because for some reason in the brain, and I still don't know the science behind this, I'm actually working with a couple people that are like doctors and psychiatrists to figure out why it is that when I look through my phone or when people with schizophrenia look sometimes into a mirror, they can't see the hallucination both in front of them and visualize them on another screen.
Mm-hmm. Just the brain can't multitask. You know, it's working so hard on one thing that it can't flip it and put it on something else.
Yeah.
So that's why mirrors and phones are just such a useful tool. And that is so fascinating. I don't know if there is an answer as to why.
It's really interesting, and I would love to learn more about it as someone who has to use it all the time. There definitely has been scenarios where I pull out my phone, though, and I'm recording a real person. So it's nice to know because, honestly, like I said, with my hallucinations being so like regular anymore and being more human-like, it gets so difficult to tell between what's real and what's a hallucination.
Right. So just to go back to your mom for a little bit, was she diagnosed schizophrenic your whole life? Was that before you, or how did she cope with her diagnosis?
It wasn't until I was about a teenager that my mom really started struggling, and her initial diagnosis was actually bipolar disorder, which is a common misdiagnosis for people with schizophrenia. And once she was finally diagnosed with schizophrenia, she was actually given schizoaffective disorder diagnosis. And schizoaffective disorder is a combination of both schizophrenia and a mood disorder like bipolar. So it's not that they were wrong about her bipolar diagnosis. They just wrote off everything she was dealing with as bipolar, because there have been cases where people with bipolar or PTSD struggle with hallucinations. And I think people assume that hallucinations are exclusive to schizophrenia when they're actually not.
Right. And I think that's just because when we're studying mental health issues and mental illnesses and psychology, the brain is so complicated. It is so complex. There's so much we don't know about the brain. And when we're talking about specific mental illnesses, there's a huge spectrum for each one. And some of them overlap with each other. A lot of symptoms are parallel. And like you said, it's not uncommon to misdiagnose somebody. So you were able to actually see how she was struggling and you saw it kind of take off. Is she doing better now than she was when you were a teenager?
Yeah, she's just like me. She's medicated now. She is doing better. Unfortunately for her, she went so long undiagnosed that by the time she did get diagnosed, she wasn't able to be as stable as I am. She does have to work with disability. She isn't able to work full time. I wish that they had caught it sooner and they were able to get her medicated properly. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, like we talk about stigma with mental health now. In the early 2000s, late 90s, it was so much worse. We've made a lot of progress. We have a long way to go, but we've definitely made a lot of progress.
I mean, we did not talk about mental health in the late 90s, early 2000s. I didn't know that my mom had depression and that's why she couldn't get out of bed and slept for 3 days.
Yeah.
I just thought, geez, she must be really freaking tired. What? So the things that seem so normal now. These conversations that we're having, they didn't happen back then. You know, it was kind of the same with drugs and alcohol. I didn't think alcohol was addictive.
Yeah.
Everyone talked about drugs. And I'm like, well, where are these drugs? You know, like it's crazy that people are just finding drugs, you know, and I was handed a beer at 12,
Yeah.
you know, and I'm like, oh, this makes me not weird anymore. And I can drink. And I never thought at 12, 20 years ago, and who's counting, that would be addicting.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and I live in Wisconsin, so if you think it was okay here, in Wisconsin, it's glorified to drink.
Mm-hmm.
And even at young ages, like I don't know a single person who made it through high school without drinking, and that's just like super normal. And then you get through like struggling with an addiction, and then you look back on it and it's super weird because we literally live, maybe it's just the whole Midwest, but we live in an area where drinking is not only accepted, but glorified. And so when people do have to start identifying it, when people have to start identifying it as an addiction, I feel like it's really tough for a lot of people.
And it's weird that we get so much shame talking about addiction. There's so much stigma surrounding that as well. I'm from New York, actually. And I'm from a town where there's like no one. So yeah, I started drinking at 12 because that was a normal thing to do in my nowhere New York town where there's like 6,000 people's the population. Don't Google it. Calm down. That's an accurate number. I would try to exaggerate it a little bit to make it a bigger town, but it literally is just filled with drugs and poverty. My hometown is 200% below the poverty line. Mental health and drug and alcohol counseling was not something that was a priority unless you were put on probation or parole. Then it was court ordered.
Yeah. Well, and that's a lot of what I dealt with too. Like I live in a really rural town, 2,000 people, not to flex. We live, so in our area, it was the same exact thing. You couldn't get help unless you were already far gone. And that's such a shame because everyone deserves a chance to take care of these things before they're an issue. Everyone deserves a chance to get treatment before they end up in a psych ward or get help before drugs take over their entire life. And I just don't feel like in most places that's something you can do. I have friends and family who try to get in to see a psychiatrist because they're depressed or because they're anxious, and they're put on a wait list or they're told they can't because it's not a huge priority.
Yeah.
And as someone with schizophrenia, obviously they let me right in I walk in the therapist's office and they all know me. Mm-hmm. But like in my area, I'm like, why aren't we also prioritizing people with anxiety and depression and people who have just as much of a struggle as I do, just in different ways?
So do you think that there's a stigma in the mental health field to think like schizophrenia is up here, depression's down here, so we need to get these people in first?
I don't know
from your experience.
I don't know if it's in the in the mental health community as it is just like in general. Mm. I think people generalize mental health as like some things are more serious than others, but someone with schizophrenia might not even have as much of a chance of taking their own life as someone with depression. And I get my symptoms are very serious and I'm grateful for the treatment I've received, but I have very close friends and family, some of which I've lost to suicide because they couldn't get help. And as someone who struggles with schizophrenia, I'm very fortunate that except for the times of my life where I was delusional, I don't struggle a lot with depression and suicidal tendencies. And I feel grateful for that, but then I'm like, why aren't we prioritizing the people who do?
Right.
Especially when suicide is such a huge issue.
You know, so I struggle with severe depression, PTSD, insomnia is worked into the PTSD. And I have on multiple occasions had suicidal thoughts, and I have attempted to take my own life a couple of times. And as much as I say that, I don't think people that have no experience with it understand.
No.
Because they're like, well, why would you want to do that? There's, so many things you can do in life, and you have a beautiful life and a beautiful family, and you have all of these things. Depression doesn't care.
No.
Doesn't care. My suicide attempts came while I was in active addiction, but I still have unalive thoughts. It's like my brain just out of the clear blue sky is like, you just shouldn't be alive anymore. You've lived enough. Like, okay, calm down. Jeez, man. Like I get the weirdest thoughts sometimes, and that's directly correlated to, my mental health. And I just don't think people understand. So if you don't understand that, just be nice and be kind to people, especially on the internet. We're human beings, and mental health and mental illness is also a very different thing. And I don't think people understand that.
Well, and that's the thing is a lot of people come to my page to learn about mental illness because they see me having a schizophrenic episode, or they want to learn more about schizophrenia in general. And then what they see a lot of is mental health content. Because yes, I have mental illness, but what I prioritize is talking about mental health in general. And that plays to, general things like anxiety, depression. It plays to more than just my schizophrenia. When it comes to mental health, we're talking about everyone with mental health issues, anyone that's looking to prioritize mental health care. And it doesn't have to be severe mental health, or it doesn't have to be severe mental illness to deserve proper mental health care.
And I think all of us struggle. I think we all struggle with something. We all have brains, and those things are complicated as hell. So I think we all have issues, whether that is social anxiety, regular anxiety, whether we've gone, through traumatic experiences and trauma and have PTSD, whether it's Bowie, schizophrenia, or bipolar. If you're narcissistic, that's a really hard one that affects everyone around you. There's a lot of mental health issues that I think we're all really familiar with, and I think we all struggle in some capacity. I kind of want to talk to you, and your work is so important. Your motivational speaking is important. Your TikToks are so good, and they're so important because I think people are seeing schizophrenia in real time from somebody that is really struggling with it, that understands it, and maybe they haven't seen it accurately depicted. So how do you think Hollywood inaccurately depicts schizophrenia? And does that negatively impact the community?
Absolutely. The main thing you'll see is violence when it comes to schizophrenia. Almost any time you look at a movie from older than the 2000s, they depict schizophrenia as a violent disorder. It still happens now, just not as much. I feel like people are a little less tone deaf to it. People are understanding it a little bit better. Yeah. So there are getting to be some really good representations of mental illness, including schizophrenia, but there will always be the really poor ones that depict schizophrenia as super violent. The other thing I see a lot of with schizophrenia portrayals is people with schizophrenia always being catatonic, where they can't function. You'll see a lot of the times people with schizophrenia are always in the psych ward. And there are so many people with schizophrenia. I don't know if everyone knows this. 1 out of 100 people in the United States have schizophrenia.
That's a lot.
There are not that many people in the psych ward. So there are a lot of people living day to day with schizophrenia, which I don't think a lot of people realize. And it's because it is very stigmatized. The other issue I see a lot of actually, though, is schizophrenia and how it's portrayed in the news. How many times have you seen schizophrenia in the news where the only time you ever hear about it is when someone with schizophrenia has a delusional state where they hurt themselves or others? And unfortunately, that's all we ever see in the news about people with schizophrenia. So it does cause people to start to think that this is inherently a dangerous disorder, or people with it are going to be violent no matter what. And that's just not the case.
Isn't it statistically accurate to say that those that struggle with schizophrenia are more likely to be the victims of violent crimes instead?
I would say you've probably seen some of my content.
Stole it.
Stole it. Yes. People with schizophrenia are much more likely to be the victims of violent crimes than to be the perpetrators of violent crimes, as are people with almost any mental illness, actually. So it's just one of those things where until people can see it in a different point of view, they're always going to assume it's more dangerous, which is why I love what I do, is because people can log on and see me and see a more settled, normal face to schizophrenia instead of the coherently crazy, violent things they get to see now.
In what ways has, movies and TV and Hollywood done a good job at depicting schizophrenia? Are there any examples of that?
There are a lot that I have yet to watch. So there are some new things that have come out specifically about like DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, and schizophrenia. There's a couple new movies, TV shows. I have yet to watch them. I do plan on it. There's one portrayal I think is done really well, and that's for anyone who watches Criminal Minds. It's Diana Reed in Criminal Minds. It's the mother of one of the main characters. She has paranoid schizophrenia, and they do a really good job at depicting her character. The other thing Criminal Minds does well, now keep in mind, I'm not saying that everything they do surrounding mental illness is perfect, but one of the things they do well is almost any time that there is a serial killer with mental illness, specifically with schizophrenia, I've noticed they almost always mention in the episode that it's super rare for people with schizophrenia to have that type of mental break where they harm themselves or others. They almost always mention that.
I feel like that's progress.
It is. And there's still obviously a lot more that can be done. Like within some of the episodes, I think, why do we have to dramatize mental illness? Why do we have to romanticize mental illness? But I know it's what people want to watch. Unfortunately, I know that's why my videos that get the most views are the ones where I'm actively having symptoms.
Yeah.
People want to see the worst of it, not always just to like gawk at it, but genuinely, I think it's to understand it better. And so it's one of those things where I think there will always be portrayals of it. So the more we can do to make it accurate, the better it'll be for destigmatizing and for understanding it better.
I'm not going to lie. When you told me when you were here last time, like last year, you said, I think I'm going to put up a camera and record my hallucinations. I said 1,000% I will watch that. Everyone's going to want to see it. It's another layer of breaking down the stigma, and you're opening your home. And what is so, how do I say this? You're opening your home and your mental health to the world on a huge platform. And you're letting people see you when you're at your most vulnerable and when you're struggling. And that authenticity is so genuine and so real. And it is truly helping people understand it better. It's heartbreaking to watch. I'm like, oh, Cody, he's not there. He's not there. So I'll watch these and my heart breaks for you. But the fact that you're willing to share that with us, I just feel like you have added so much to the conversation of mental health, and you're helping save lives. Maybe someone saw that and thought, I should go get diagnosed, or maybe someone is experiencing that in someone else's lives, like their parents or their siblings or whatever. And they're like, this is what this is. This makes sense now, so I just can't thank you enough for what you do on TikTok and YouTube. I know that you're changing and saving lives, and I just appreciate every second of your content. And I know so many others do as well. Where can everyone find you? And is there anything else you want to say before I kick you out of my filming space? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So you guys can find me either on TikTok at Schizophrenic Hippie, YouTube also with the same username, and I'm also on Instagram.
Why Schizophrenic Hippie?
The name Schizophrenic Hippie was kind of something I did to get back at someone who left a hate comment. I actually had, when I did my very first video about my schizophrenia on TikTok, someone left a comment and they said, well, you just look like a schizophrenic hippie. And I decided that was going to be my new username. So I took it. And I recently found out that is my username and it is going to stay with me. So
I love it. I'm probably going to name this episode Diagnosed Schizophrenic Conversation. Does that offend you when I say, when I title things like that when we interview you?
Absolutely not. I think that there are like weird terms that people don't like about mental illness. Mm-hmm. Doesn't really bother me anyway.
The reason why I'm saying that is because I titled our last interview as that. Diagnosed Schizophrenic opens up about his diagnosis or something like that. And someone commented, that is really offensive. And I stole it from your channel.
Yeah. Well, just for anyone out there, I am a diagnosed schizophrenic person. Yeah. And I think some people prefer person with schizophrenia, but I and several other schizophrenia advocates I know have no issue with it. So it does come down to personal preference. Not everyone's going to agree with it, but it's all right with me.
It's difficult to fit so many words in a title too. You know what I mean? I just had to close with that because I know that I got one comment about it, about how I shouldn't have ever said that. And I just always want to make sure I'm getting the terminology correct when talking about this. You know, there's things that I don't like people say about me with my mental health or my recovery. You know, this isn't about me, but I'm just saying, always want to make sure we get the things right. I will leave Cody's information for all of his platforms in the description box of this video. You are going to want to go see his TikTok videos that he's going to put on YouTube. He's going to. I will force him to. It's just eye-opening, heartbreaking, and educational all in the same breath, all at the same time. I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I will talk at you in my next one.